I know you'll judge the main character, but tell me honestly, could you resist?
New cities were supposed to be full of possibilities, a fresh start, a chance to reinvent yourself. That's what I kept telling myself as I downed the last of my vodka soda, feeling the burn slide down my throat. I had only been in this town for 2 weeks, still living out of boxes, still figuring out where the hell everything was. The idea of spending another Friday night alone in my half-unpacked apartment had driven me here, to a bar that was too loud, too crowded, and exactly what I needed. I didn't come here looking for anything, but then he sat down next to me. Tall, dark hair, sharp jawline, the kind of confidence that wasn't forced, just natural. He didn't introduce himself right away, just ordered a whiskey neat and glanced at me with a smirk like he knew exactly how this was going to end. "New in town?" he asked, his voice smooth, casual. I hesitated for half a second before nodding. That obvious. He let out a soft chuckle. "You've been staring at your drink like it's got the answers to all your problems. Locals don't do that." I huffed a laugh, swirling the ice in my glass. Maybe I was just waiting for the right distraction. His smirk deepened. "That so?" I should have stopped it there. I should have played it safe, made some polite small talk and walked away. But there was something about him, the way he watched me like he already knew what I wanted, the way his fingers tapped absently against his glass like he was just waiting for me to make the first move. So I did. I leaned in, letting the alcohol do half the work, and let a smirk of my own slip onto my lips. "Tell me your name." He tilted his head slightly, eyes dark with amusement. "How about we skip that part?" I should have questioned it, I should have cared, but right then in that moment I didn't, because I didn't want a name. I wanted an escape, and that's exactly what I got. I woke up tangled in sheets that weren't mine. The early morning light streamed through the window, cutting through the haze of last night's decisions. My body ached in a way that only came from really good sex or really bad choices, or in this case, both. I barely moved, my heart hammering as I tried to put the night back together. His hands, his mouth, the way he had laughed when I whispered my name, except it wasn't my real name. I had given him a fake one. It had felt thrilling at the time, the kind of thing people did in movies. No expectations, no reality, just one night where I could be whoever I wanted to be. And then he stirred beside me. "Morning, gorgeous," he murmured, voice rough with sleep. His hand slid lazily over my waist like he had every intention of picking up where we left off. I should have felt awkward, embarrassed, but instead I just smiled, stretching against the sheets before slipping out of bed. I should go. He propped himself up on one elbow, watching me with that same unreadable smirk. No breakfast, no names. I tugged my dress over my head, flashing him a teasing look. That was the deal, wasn't it? He let out a low chuckle. Fair enough. I was out the door before I could second-guess myself, my heart still racing from the thrill of it. One night, no strings, no names. I had no idea just how wrong I was. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur. I tried to shake off the lingering thoughts of the mystery man whose name I never asked, telling myself it was just one night, exactly as I had planned. I unpacked another few boxes, binged a mindless reality show, and did everything I could to distract myself. It worked, mostly. Monday morning came too soon, and I found myself standing in front of my closet, debating between looking professional or not caring at all. This was supposed to be my fresh start, a new job, a new city, a new life. I threw on a fitted blouse and a pair of tailored pants, grabbed my bag, and headed out the door. The office was sleek and modern, filled with the kind of people who looked like they spent more time curating their LinkedIn profiles than actually working. I had been through the onboarding process remotely, but today was my first official day in person. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and stepped inside. "You must be Olivia," a warm voice greeted me. I turned to see a woman in her mid-40s, stylish but approachable, offering me a handshake. "I'm Karen, the HR manager. We're thrilled to have you on board." I smiled, shaking her hand. "Thank you, I'm excited to be here." She led me through the maze of desks, introducing me to coworkers whose names I instantly forgot. Eventually, we stopped in front of an office with floor-to-ceiling windows, and Karen knocked twice before pushing the door open. "And here, where you'll be working closely with our senior management team, let me introduce you to." The words barely registered as he turned around in his chair. The same piercing gaze, the same sharp jawline, the same confident smirk that had been burned into my memory from 2 nights ago. No. My heart nearly stopped as he stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, looking just as stunned as I felt. His eyes flicked to Karen, then back to me. "Olivia, this is Ethan Montgomery. He's our VP of Strategy and your direct superior." For a split second, no one spoke. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. I saw the realization click in his eyes as he took me in, his expression unreadable. Karen, oblivious to the sheer chaos unfolding in my brain, smiled. "I'll leave you two to get acquainted." The door shut behind her and the silence stretched between us. I finally found my voice, though it came out quieter than I wanted. So much for no names. Ethan let out a breath, rubbing his temple before looking at me with an unreadable expression. Yeah, so much for that. I wanted to run, I wanted to disappear. Instead, I took a seat across from him, feeling my entire fresh start unraveling before my eyes. And I had a terrible feeling this was only the beginning. Sitting across from Ethan in his office felt surreal, like some kind of cruel joke the universe had decided to play on me. Just 2 days ago, we were tangled in his sheets, whispering things meant for one night only. And now, here we were locked in a professional setting where he was my boss and I was his subordinate. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "So, Olivia," he finally said, his voice measured, controlled, "this is unexpected." Understatement of the century, I forced a stiff nod. Yeah, definitely not how I imagined my first day going. His lips twitched like he wanted to smirk but thought better of it. Agreed. Look, I think we both know we have to keep things professional here. What happened, it stays in the past. I exhaled slowly, nodding again. Of course, absolutely. He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. That won't be a problem for you. I straightened in my seat, refusing to let him see how much my stomach was in knots. Not at all, we're adults, we can handle this. Good. His gaze lingered on me for just a second too long before he cleared his throat and grabbed a file from his desk. Here's your onboarding package. Go through it, familiarize yourself with everything, and we'll have our first strategy meeting later this week. I reached for the folder, careful not to let our fingers touch. Sounds good. I stood, ready to escape the unbearable tension in the room, but before I could take a step, Ethan spoke again. Olivia. I turned back to him, forcing myself to keep my expression neutral. Yes. His jaw tightened for half a second before he exhaled, shaking his head. Nothing, just welcome to the team. I nodded once before slipping out the door, my heart hammering. This wasn't just complicated, it was a disaster waiting to happen, and something told me we weren't nearly finished making mistakes. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through my onboarding documents, met a handful of colleagues whose names I immediately forgot, and tried to convince myself that working under Ethan wouldn't be as disastrous as it felt. But no matter how much I tried to focus, my mind kept circling back to him, his voice, his presence, the impossible situation we were now trapped in. By the time lunch rolled around, I decided to step out for some air. The office break room was too small, too filled with people who were already forming their own cliques, and I needed space to breathe. I grabbed my bag and headed down to the cafe across the street, hoping a walk and some caffeine would help reset my spiraling thoughts. Just as I reached the cafe counter, debating between an iced coffee or something stronger, a familiar voice sent a shiver down my spine. Surprised you made it through the morning without running for the hills. I turned and there he was, Ethan, standing just a few feet away, hands in his pockets, that same unreadable expression on his face. The cafe suddenly felt smaller, the air a little thinner. I forced a neutral smile, pretending my pulse hadn't just kicked up a notch. Well, it's only my first day. Give me at least a week before I start contemplating an exit plan. Ethan chuckled, stepping closer, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I meant what I said earlier, we keep things professional, no distractions. I arched a brow. You think I'd be the one causing distractions? His gaze flickered over me, unreadable yet intent. I think we both know how easy it would be to let things get complicated. A sharp heat curled in my stomach, but I shoved it aside, refusing to let him see how much he affected me. I folded my arms, leaning slightly against the counter. Good thing we're both professionals then. Ethan held my gaze for another beat before nodding slowly. Good thing. The barista called my order, breaking the moment. I grabbed my coffee, gave Ethan one last glance, then turned and walked away, ignoring the way my entire body buzzed from the tension. I told myself this was just another job, just another boss. But deep down, I knew the truth. This was already spiraling into something neither of us could control. By the time I returned to the office, my coffee half drunk and my thoughts still tangled in knots, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't going to be easy. No matter how much Ethan and I tried to play it cool, to keep things professional, the electricity between us was undeniable, and that was dangerous. I settled back at my desk, forcing my attention onto my emails, but my focus shattered the moment I saw a message pop up in my inbox. Ethan Montgomery meeting at 3, my office. 3 simple words, but my pulse still jumped. I shook my head, annoyed at my own reaction. This was just work, it had to be just work. The hours crawled by until, finally, the clock struck 3. I grabbed my notebook and forced myself to walk into Ethan's office with the confidence of someone who wasn't internally freaking out. He was already seated, reviewing something on his laptop. When I entered, he glanced up, his expression unreadable, closed the door. I hesitated for only a second before obeying, telling myself it was standard office protocol, nothing more. I sat across from him, notebook in hand, waiting for him to speak. Ethan exhaled, setting his pen down. We need to be clear about something. I nodded, even though I already knew where this was going. Whatever happened that night, it stays in the past. No tension, no distractions, agreed. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to nod again. Agreed. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air in the room grew heavier, the space between us shrinking despite the physical distance. His eyes flickered over me, something unspoken lingering between us before he finally looked away. Good, he muttered, almost as if he was convincing himself. He cleared his throat, pushing a document toward me. Now, let's focus on work. I took the paper, pretending like my hands weren't shaking slightly, pretending like I wasn't already breaking the rule we had just set. Because the problem with fires like this, they don't just go out, they spread. I walked out of Ethan's office, gripping the document in my hands like it was a lifeline, something tangible to keep me from spiraling. My mind replayed our conversation on an endless loop. No tension, no distractions, agreed. He had said it like a command, like a rule that could actually be followed. But the flicker in his eyes told me otherwise. He wasn't immune to this any more than I was. I forced myself to focus, diving into work as if sheer willpower could overwrite the past. For the rest of the afternoon, I managed to ignore the way my skin prickled whenever Ethan walked past my desk, the way my heart picked up speed at the sound of his voice in the conference room. It was fine, I was fine. Then came the evening social event, a harmless company gathering at a rooftop bar, something I had planned to attend for networking, not for a test of self-control. The moment I arrived, I regretted it. Ethan was already there, standing near the bar, engaged in easy conversation with a group of colleagues. He looked at ease, like none of this was affecting him. Meanwhile, I felt like a live wire, ready to short-circuit at any second. I tried to avoid him, I really did. I stayed near my coworkers, laughed in all the right places, kept a drink in my hand as a distraction, but it didn't matter, because at some point he found me. Enjoying yourself? His voice was smooth, unreadable. I turned, forcing a polite smile, trying to. His gaze lingered on me for a beat too long. Good, but there was something behind that simple word, something that sent a slow, simmering heat through me. I should have walked away, should have put more space between us. But I didn't. Instead, I let the moment stretch, let the air between us thicken with everything we weren't saying. This was dangerous, we both knew it. And yet, neither of us moved. I told myself I'd keep my distance, that I wouldn't let him get to me, but that resolve shattered the moment Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just for me. You look different tonight. It wasn't a compliment, not exactly, but the way his eyes traced over me sent a shiver down my spine. It's called wearing something other than office attire, I replied smoothly, sipping my drink to cover the heat creeping up my neck. He smirked, tilting his head slightly. It suits you. A simple statement, yet somehow it made my pulse quicken. I should have ended the conversation there, excused myself, blended back into the crowd, but I didn't, because despite every warning screaming in my head, I wanted to hear what he'd say next. The air between us thickened, a silent battle of willpower neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Around us, the party carried on laughter, clinking glasses, easy conversation, but in this small pocket of space, it was just us. This isn't smart, I muttered, more to myself than to him. No, it isn't, he agreed, but there was no regret in his voice, no hesitation. A group of coworkers passed by, momentarily breaking the spell. I exhaled, forcing myself to step back to regain some semblance of control. I should go find my team, I said, a weak attempt at pulling away. Ethan studied me for a moment, then gave a slow nod, probably for the best. But as I turned and walked away, I knew this wasn't over, not even close. I spent the rest of the night trying to ignore the way my skin tingled from Ethan's lingering gaze, but it was impossible. Every time I caught a glimpse of him across the room, talking to colleagues, sipping his drink, I felt like I was holding my breath. I hated how easily he got under my skin, how effortlessly he made me forget every reason I had for staying away. By the time I slipped outside for fresh air, my head was spinning, not from the alcohol, but from the sheer weight of the situation. I leaned against the balcony railing, closing my eyes for a moment, trying to steady myself. Escaping already, his voice was low, smooth, and entirely too close. I turned my head slightly, catching sight of Ethan standing beside me, his hands casually resting in his pockets. Just needed some air. The party was getting a little overwhelming. He nodded, stepping closer, the space between us shrinking. Yeah, I get that. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words, with everything we weren't saying but both understood. I could feel the warmth of his body just inches away, and it took everything in me not to lean into it. "We keep doing this," I murmured, my voice barely audible over the distant hum of the city below. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know, and I keep telling myself to stop." I turned to face him fully, my pulse hammering. "Then why don't we?" His jaw tensed, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that sent heat curling through my stomach. "Because I don't want to." The words hung between us, heavy and dangerous. Every rational part of me screamed to walk away, to end this before it spiraled any further. But when Ethan reached for me, his fingers brushing against mine, I knew I wasn't going anywhere. The moment Ethan's fingers brushed against mine, a spark shot up my arm, setting fire to every nerve in my body. I should have pulled away. I should have reminded myself of every reason this was a mistake, but I didn't. Instead, I let the moment stretch, let the heat between us grow unbearable. My mind screamed at me to put distance between us, to remember where we were, who we were, but my body had other plans. The warmth of his touch seeped into my skin, making it impossible to ignore the way my breath caught in my throat. Every logical thought fled, replaced by the pure, unrelenting awareness of him. His scent, his presence, the way his eyes locked onto mine like he could see straight through me. There was something dangerous in the way he watched me. He didn't say anything, just watched me, waiting, giving me the chance to stop this before it started. But I didn't step back, and neither did he. Before I could second-guess myself, his hand slid up my arm, slow and deliberate, sending a shiver through me. The tension between us was a living thing, thick and consuming, wrapping around us like an invisible force. It wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface since the moment I walked into his office. Every stolen glance, every unspoken word, every moment of restraint had led to this. And now, with the night pressing in around us, there was no more pretending. "This is a bad idea," I whispered, though my body betrayed me by leaning into him. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it, could feel the way my pulse raced beneath his fingertips. My words felt weak, like they had no real conviction behind them, like they were nothing more than a desperate attempt to hold on to something that had already slipped through my grasp. I should have meant them. I should have walked away. Ethan let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening just slightly around my wrist. "The worst," he murmured, but there was no hesitation in his voice. There was no uncertainty in the way he looked at me, no doubt in the way his grip firmed, pulling me just a little closer. There was only raw, undeniable need, an understanding that we had already fallen too far to stop now. It was inevitable, the collision of everything we had tried to suppress, and I knew, deep in the pit of my stomach, I knew there was no stopping this now. I wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly we weren't just standing close. We were tangled in each other, his mouth on mine, my hands gripping his shirt like it was the only thing keeping me upright. The kiss wasn't soft, it wasn't gentle. It was the release of every ounce of restraint we had fought to keep, every suppressed thought, every heated glance, finally breaking free. His hands were on my waist, pulling me against him, and I let myself get lost in the feeling, let myself forget every consequence that would come crashing down in the morning. Right now, all that mattered was this moment, the way he felt, the way he tasted, the way his body molded so perfectly against mine like he was meant to be there all along. His hand slid down to my waist, pulling me flush against him as I melted into his touch. The world around us ceased to exist, no colleagues, no job, no logic, just heat and the sound of our ragged breaths in the cool night air. Every thought of consequence, of risk, faded into the background, drowned out by the sheer intensity of the moment. I had spent weeks trying to ignore the way he made me feel, telling myself it was nothing more than a fleeting attraction, but standing here, pressed against him, feeling the way he held onto me like he wasn't willing to let go, I knew it had never been that simple. Then, just as suddenly as it began, Ethan pulled back, his forehead resting against mine. "We can't do this here," he murmured, his voice rough, his breath warm against my lips. His hands didn't leave my waist, didn't loosen their grip, but his words carried a weight I couldn't ignore. It was a reminder, a reality check that tried to claw its way back into my mind. And yet, even knowing he was right, even knowing we were playing with fire, I couldn't find it in myself to care. I swallowed hard, nodding, my own breath uneven. Then where? The question barely left my lips before I realized what I had just done, what I had just agreed to. There was no stopping this now. The door had been opened, and neither of us had the willpower to close it. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice, one I was making without hesitation. A flicker of something dark passed through his eyes before he took my hand, threading his fingers through mine. "Let's get out of here." I didn't argue, I didn't hesitate. I let him lead me away, knowing that whatever happened next, there would be no turning back. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The drive to Ethan's place was quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was thick with tension, with anticipation that clung to the air like static before a storm. I kept my hands clenched in my lap, my breath measured, my mind spinning with the gravity of what I was about to do. Every rational part of me was screaming to turn back, to stop this before it unraveled into something we couldn't control. But it was too late for that. I had already crossed the line the moment I let him take my hand, the moment I willingly walked away from the party with him. There was no undoing it now, no pretending that this was just an accident. Ethan barely looked at me as he drove, but his grip on the steering wheel was tight, his jaw clenched like he was fighting the same war inside himself. The city lights flashed past us in a blur, illuminating the sharp angles of his face, the way his knuckles whitened every time he flexed his fingers. I wanted to say something to break the suffocating silence, but nothing felt right. Words weren't enough for what was happening between us. This wasn't about logic or reason anymore. This was something deeper, something reckless and dangerous, something we both knew could end in disaster. And yet, neither of us stopped. When we finally pulled up to his building, he killed the engine and sat there for a moment, his hands still gripping the wheel. My heartbeat was a frantic rhythm against my ribs, my palms damp where they rested against my thighs. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, the way his breathing had slowed, controlled, but strained. "Olivia," he said finally, his voice low, careful, "you don't have to do this." I swallowed hard, turning to face him. "Do you want me to leave?" His jaw tensed, and for the first time that night, something uncertain flickered in his eyes. "No, but that's not the point." I held his stare, the space between us charged with something volatile. "Then what is?" Ethan exhaled sharply, his fingers running through his hair. "That if you come inside with me, there's no going back, no pretending this didn't happen." A shiver ran down my spine, but I didn't look away. "I know." He studied me for a long moment, like he was searching for any hesitation, any flicker of doubt, but there wasn't any. I had made my choice before I even got in the car. Finally, without another word, he pushed the door open and stepped out. I followed, my body humming with the weight of what was about to happen. The elevator ride up was slow, each second stretching into eternity. Neither of us spoke, but I could feel the tension rolling off him in waves, the heat of it wrapping around me like an invisible tether. When the door slid open, Ethan led me down the hall to his apartment, his movements careful, measured. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, leaving it open for me to follow. I did, heart hammering, breath uneven. The second the door clicked shut behind me, everything shifted. No more hesitation, no more unspoken tension. Ethan turned, his eyes dark, his expression unreadable, and before I could process what was happening, his hands were on me, pulling me against him. His mouth crashed onto mine, the force of it stealing my breath, igniting every nerve in my body. There was nothing gentle about it. This was weeks of restraint snapping, unraveling in an instant. My fingers tangled in his shirt, pulling him closer, drinking in the heat of him, the way his hands gripped my waist like he was afraid to let go. We moved without thinking, without pause. His jacket hit the floor. My fingers worked at the buttons of his shirt, desperate, needy. There was no space between us anymore, no barriers. This was happening, and I didn't want to stop it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was dangerous. I knew we were playing with fire. But as his lips traced a burning path down my neck, as his hands explored every inch of me, I realized something else. I didn't care. Because this wasn't just about lust or about making another mistake. This was inevitable, written into the fabric of whatever force had drawn us together from the start. There had never been a choice, not really. And there was no turning back now. The next morning, I woke up tangled in sheets that weren't mine, the scent of Ethan's cologne still lingering on my skin. My body ached in ways that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with the way we had spent the night. The room was still dimly lit, the early morning sun just beginning to creep through the blinds, casting slanted golden lines across the bed. For a fleeting moment, I let myself exist in this quiet bubble, wrapped in warmth, pretending that reality didn't exist outside these walls. But then the weight of what had happened crashed down on me. I wasn't just in Ethan's bed, I wasn't just tangled up in his sheets. I had crossed every single line I had sworn to myself I wouldn't, and now there was no taking it back. My breath hitched slightly, my fingers gripping the blanket as if it could somehow ground me. Ethan stirred beside me, a slow, satisfied sound leaving his lips before his arm tightened around my waist, pulling me back against him. "You're thinking too much," he murmured against my skin, his voice rough from sleep. I squeezed my eyes shut, hating how easily he could read me. I should go, I whispered, though my body betrayed me by staying exactly where I was. He sighed, pressing a slow, lazy kiss to my shoulder before leaning back. And what happens if you do? I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze. There was something unreadable in his expression, something softer than I expected, something careful. Then this gets even more complicated than it already is. He smirked, but there was no humor behind it. Olivia, I think we're way past complicated. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding against my ribs. He wasn't wrong. There was no clean way out of this, no way to erase what had happened. We had already set this into motion, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I could just walk away, I knew deep down that I wouldn't. Sliding out of bed, I grabbed my clothes, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled my dress over my head. Ethan watched me silent, his gaze unreadable. "So that's it?" he finally asked. "You're just going to pretend last night didn't happen?" I hesitated for half a second before shaking my head. "No, but I need time to figure out what this means." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Fair enough, but don't take too long, because I'm not sure I can go back to pretending." His words lingered long after I left, settling into my chest like a weight I wasn't sure I could carry, because the truth was, I wasn't sure I could pretend either. The rest of the week felt like a slow-motion car crash, every moment leading to an inevitable impact that I wasn't ready for. I threw myself into work, trying to bury the memory of that night beneath meetings, spreadsheets, and emails, but it was impossible. Every time I looked up, I felt Ethan's eyes on me. Every time he passed by, the air grew heavier, charged with something neither of us had the strength to ignore. I told myself I needed space. That I had to put some kind of barrier between us before this spiraled further out of control. But Ethan, he wasn't having it. By Wednesday, he had stopped playing along with my avoidance tactics. He caught me at the coffee station in the break room, stepping just a little too close, his voice just a little too low. "Are you planning on avoiding me forever, or just until one of us quits?" I stiffened, gripping my cup a little too tightly. "I'm not avoiding you." His smirk was knowing, almost amused. "Right, that's why you left early from Monday's meeting and have been conveniently too busy for any one-on-one discussions." I exhaled slowly, willing my pulse to settle. "Ethan," we agreed. "No, you decided. I never agreed to pretend nothing happened." I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. "We can't do this." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he let out a quiet laugh. "Olivia, we're already doing this, whether you like it or not." Before I could respond, someone cleared their throat behind us. I turned, my stomach flipping when I saw Karen from HR standing there, eyes flicking between Ethan and me with something too sharp to be casual. "Didn't mean to interrupt," she said smoothly, though I could tell she didn't mean it. "But we need you in the conference room, Ethan." He nodded once but didn't look away from me. "We're not done talking about this." I swallowed as he walked past me, my entire body still humming from the tension he left in his wake. But it wasn't just Ethan I needed to worry about. It was the way Karen had looked at us, the way her expression had shifted just slightly, like she had already put together more than I wanted her to. And that's when I realized people were starting to notice. The little glances, the lingering looks, the way conversations seemed to quiet when I entered the room. It wasn't paranoia, it was real. By Friday, I felt like I was suffocating. Every move I made felt like it was being watched, every interaction with Ethan laced with an undercurrent of something unspoken. I should have put an end to it right then and there. Instead, I found myself in his office after hours, his gaze burning into mine as I tried to find the words to say what needed to be said. "We have to stop this," I murmured, gripping the edge of his desk like it could somehow ground me. "People are noticing." Ethan's jaw tensed, his hands resting on either side of his desk, caging me in without even touching me. "So what, let them." "Ethan," I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper, "this could ruin everything." His eyes searched mine, a flicker of something dark and unreadable passing through them. "Then tell me you don't want this. Tell me last night meant nothing." I opened my mouth, but no words came out, because I couldn't say it. I couldn't lie, not to him, not to myself. His expression softened just slightly. "That's what I thought." The space between us vanished, his lips capturing mine before I could think, before I could stop it. And just like that, all my carefully constructed walls came crashing down. This was beyond dangerous, beyond reckless, but as his hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to let go. By Monday morning, I could barely breathe under the weight of what was happening. The walls I had so desperately tried to build between Ethan and me had crumbled, leaving me exposed, vulnerable, and completely trapped in something I could no longer control. I woke up with the memory of his hands on my waist, his lips against mine, and the undeniable feeling that we had stepped into something neither of us were ready for. And yet, I had let it happen. Again. The office was different now, or maybe it was just me. Every glance felt heavier, every whispered conversation seemed to hold a hidden meaning, and every interaction with Ethan sent a pulse of heat through my body that I couldn't ignore. I caught Karen from HR watching me twice, her lips pressed into a thin line as if she were waiting for me to slip up. Maybe she already knew, maybe they all did. I wasn't paranoid, I was aware, and the worst part, I didn't know how to stop it. By lunchtime, my nerves were shot. I tried to distract myself with work, but every email, every project update, every meeting reminder only dragged me deeper into the reality that there was no escaping this. I needed air, needed to step away before I suffocated under the weight of my own reckless decisions. I made my way to the rooftop terrace, hoping for a moment of solitude, but the moment I stepped outside, my breath caught in my throat. Ethan was already there, leaning against the railing, his hands gripping the metal as if he were holding himself back from something. The wind ruffled his dark hair, his sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the tension in his forearms. He turned his head slightly, sensing my presence before I even spoke. "You keep finding me," he murmured, his voice low, edged with something dangerous. I swallowed, my heart pounding. I could say the same about you. He let out a slow breath, turning fully to face me. "You're avoiding me." I folded my arms over my chest, trying to create a barrier that no longer existed. "I'm trying to be smart about this." Ethan's lips quirked in a humorless smirk. "And how's that working out for you?" It was, and we both knew it. I sighed, leaning against the railing beside him, but keeping my eyes trained on the city skyline. People are talking, I can feel it. Let them talk. I turned to him, exasperated. "Ethan, this isn't just some office rumor. If Karen finds out, if anyone finds out." He cut me off with a look, his jaw tightening. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't wake up every damn morning knowing exactly what's at stake here, but knowing that doesn't change anything. It doesn't make me want you any less." My breath hitched, my fingers gripping the edge of the railing like it was the only thing keeping me from unraveling completely. We're playing with fire. Ethan took a step closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint scent of his cologne, then let it burn. And just like that, whatever fight I had left in me disappeared, because the truth was I wanted to burn too. The rest of the week was a game of avoidance, but it wasn't working. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see him. Every meeting, every casual office interaction carried an undercurrent of something unspoken, something that buzzed just beneath the surface. My heart pounded whenever Ethan was in the same room, and I could feel the heat of his gaze on me even when I refused to look. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. By Thursday, the tension reached a boiling point. I had convinced myself that keeping things professional meant putting distance between us, but I should have known Ethan wouldn't let that slide. I was organizing files in the storage room when the door clicked shut behind me. I froze, my breath catching, and when I turned, Ethan was there, his expression unreadable, his body blocking the exit. "What are you doing?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, but my nerves were fraying at the edges. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm, "and you've been dodging me all week." I swallowed hard, stepping back even though there was nowhere to go. "Ethan," someone could walk in. His lips quirked into something that wasn't quite a smirk. "Then we better keep our voices down." A rush of heat spread through me, and I hated how easily he could do this, how effortlessly he unraveled me. "This is a mistake." He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming, suffocating in the best and worst way. "Then tell me to stop, tell me you don't want this." I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come because I couldn't say it. We both knew it. Ethan exhaled, his frustration evident, but there was something softer beneath it, something almost vulnerable. "We can't keep pretending, Olivia, it's too late for that." My chest tightened. "It doesn't matter what we want, there are consequences, real ones." He nodded, his jaw tense. "I know, but I don't care." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. I wanted to fight it, to be the responsible one, but the truth was, I didn't care either. And then, before I could second-guess myself, I reached for him. The moment our lips met, every warning, every rational thought disappeared. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me against him, and I melted into him like I had been waiting for this moment all my life. It was reckless, it was dangerous, and I didn't want it to stop. I wasn't sure how long we stood there, lost in each other, but the sound of footsteps outside the door sent a jolt through me. Reality slammed back into place, and I pulled away, my breathing unsteady. Ethan's gaze was dark, still burning with everything we hadn't said. "This isn't over," he murmured. And deep down, I knew he was right. I left the storage room with my heart pounding so violently I could hear it echo in my ears. My hands trembled as I smoothed my blouse, my mind spinning with what had just happened. This wasn't a small mistake anymore. This wasn't something I could just brush off and pretend didn't mean anything. Ethan had kissed me like he was staking his claim, like he had decided that whatever this was between us, it wasn't something he was willing to walk away from, and I had let him. Worse, I had kissed him back. I barely made it to my desk before my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with shaky fingers, my breath catching when I saw his name. Ethan, my office. Now my pulse quickened, but I hesitated. There was a difference between stolen moments behind closed doors and facing this head-on in broad daylight. If I went to his office now, it would mean acknowledging that there was no undoing this. But maybe I had already accepted that. I rose from my chair, ignoring the questioning glance from my coworker as I made my way toward the executive wing. When I reached Ethan's office, the door was already slightly ajar, like he had been expecting me. I stepped inside, shutting it behind me. He was leaning against his desk, arms crossed, his eyes unreadable as they locked onto mine. "You hesitated," he noted, his voice calm but edged with something I couldn't place. "Because I know what this is," I admitted, my throat tight, "and I know what it could cost us." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not asking you to throw your career away, Olivia, but I can't pretend this isn't happening. I won't." I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. "What are we supposed to do?" Ethan straightened, taking a slow step toward me. "We make a choice. Either we stop now or we figure this out together." The weight of his words settled heavily between us. I knew what the right choice was, the smart one, the one that would keep my life intact. But as Ethan reached for me, his fingers brushing over mine, I realized something terrifying. I didn't want to be smart anymore. I wanted him. Silence wrapped around us like a force field, the only sound in the office being the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Ethan took another step forward, his gaze dark and unwavering. "If we do this, we have to be careful. No one can know, not yet." I nodded slowly, my fingers curling slightly as his brushed against them again. "I understand, but that doesn't make it any less dangerous." A smirk ghosted over his lips, though there was no amusement in his eyes. What's life without a little risk? I let out a shaky breath, my resistance crumbling. He was right, there was no turning back now. And as much as I wanted to pretend I was still debating this, I knew I had already made my decision long before I stepped into his office. Ethan reached up, tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear, his touch lingering just a second too long. "I'll follow your lead, Olivia. If you tell me to stop, I will." I stared up at him, my heart pounding. "I don't want you to stop." And that was it. Whatever barriers had been left between us shattered completely. Ethan moved fast, his hands gripping my waist, pulling me against him with a need that matched my own. His mouth found mine, and the moment his lips touched me, the rest of the world ceased to exist. I clung to him, letting myself drown in the kiss, in the heat, in the undeniable pull that had been drawing us together from the start. This was reckless, this was dangerous, but for the first time in a long time I didn't care, because I had already made my choice and it was him. The weight of my decision followed me long after I left Ethan's office. The lines between right and wrong had blurred so completely that I could barely remember which side I was supposed to be standing on. Every step back to my desk felt heavier, my pulse still unsteady from the way he had touched me, from the way I had let him. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was a choice, a reckless, all-consuming choice that I had no intention of undoing. For the next few days, we did what we had to, kept our distance when people were around, kept our conversations strictly professional, avoided each other just enough to maintain the illusion that nothing was happening. But beneath the surface, it was unbearable. Every meeting, every stolen glance across the office, every moment where his hand almost brushed against mine was charged with something we both refused to name out loud. I wasn't naive enough to think we were fooling anyone. Karen's sharp glances had only grown more frequent, and more than once, I had caught a few coworkers exchanging looks when Ethan and I happened to be in the same room. By Friday, the tension had reached a suffocating peak. I had managed to keep myself in check all week, to keep my head down and my emotions in line. But the second I stepped into the elevator and the doors slid shut behind me, Ethan was there. Alone, standing just inches away, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. I exhaled sharply, my fingers curling at my sides. "Ethan, we can't." "I know," he interrupted, his voice low and controlled, "but that doesn't change anything, does it?" The air between us crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of every moment we had ignored, with the inevitability of where this was going. I should have told him to back off. I should have reminded myself of what we stood to lose, but instead I found myself stepping closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. "This is getting dangerous." Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, though there was nothing amused about it. It was always dangerous, we just stopped pretending it was. The elevator slowed to a stop, and before I could say anything else, the doors slid open. He didn't move, didn't step away. "Neither did I come over tonight," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. "No expectations, just us." I hesitated. I should have said no, I should have walked away, but the truth was I didn't want to. "Okay," I breathed, and before I could take it back, I stepped out of the elevator, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to stop. I barely made it through the rest of the workday. The knowledge that I had agreed to see Ethan outside of the office hung over me like a live wire, buzzing with anticipation and reckless excitement. My hands shook slightly as I packed up my things, ignoring the questioning glance from a coworker as I all but bolted out of the office. I didn't have an explanation for what I was doing, only the undeniable fact that I wanted to do it. By the time I arrived at Ethan's place, the sun had already set, casting the city in a warm golden haze. I hesitated at his door, my heart hammering, every logical part of me screaming to turn around, to walk away before I lost myself completely. But then the door opened, and there he was, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his expression unreadable, and suddenly I wasn't thinking at all. He stepped aside, letting me in without a word. The air between us was thick with something unspoken, something that had been building for weeks. I placed my bag down, my fingers grazing the edge of the table as I tried to ground myself. "You didn't say anything all day," I finally murmured, breaking the silence. Ethan shut the door behind me, his eyes locked onto mine. "Didn't need to, you knew you were coming." A shiver ran through me, my pulse quickening. "And what happens now?" He took a slow step closer, his presence overwhelming, intoxicating. "That's up to you." I swallowed hard, the gravity of the moment settling deep into my bones. I could still walk away. I could end this before it consumed me completely. But as Ethan reached for me, his fingers brushing my wrist, I knew I wouldn't. I tilted my chin up, meeting his gaze. "I don't want to stop." That was all it took. His lips crashed against mine, his hands gripping my waist as he pulled me closer, his body warm and solid against mine. There was nothing careful about the way he kissed me, no hesitation, no second guessing. It was raw, desperate, inevitable. We stumbled back, bumping against the table as his hands roamed my body, memorizing every curve, every sharp inhale. I clung to him, my fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him impossibly closer. There was no going back now, no pretending this wasn't happening. We had already crossed the line, and now we were diving headfirst into the deep end. The night stretched on, a blur of whispered words and tangled sheets of stolen moments that felt too perfect to be real. But as I lay beside him, my fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest, a thought settled into my mind like a slow-acting poison. This couldn't last, it never could. And yet, I wasn't ready to let go. Morning came too soon, pulling me from the fragile cocoon of warmth and reckless abandon I had wrapped myself in the night before. I blinked against the soft light filtering through the curtains, momentarily disoriented before the events of the last few hours came rushing back. Ethan's arm was draped lazily over my waist, his breathing slow and steady against the curve of my shoulder. For a moment, I let myself savor it, the quiet, the comfort, the illusion that this was something simple, something safe. But it was. I shifted carefully, sliding out from under his arm and sitting up. My body still hummed from his touch, but my mind was already spiraling, already cataloging every way this was destined to fall apart. Last night had felt inevitable, like the collision of two forces that had been careening toward each other for weeks. But now, in the pale light of morning, the weight of reality settled onto my chest like a stone. I ran a hand through my hair, staring down at him, at the way his jaw was relaxed in sleep, the tension he always carried in his body momentarily erased. I had never seen him like this, vulnerable, unarmored, and that terrified me. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my stomach twisting when I saw the missed calls, 1 from my mother, 3 from my sister, and a text from Karen. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it, dread curling in my stomach before I even read the words. "Karen, can you stop by my office first thing? Need to discuss something important." My fingers tightened around the phone, my pulse spiking. This was it. This was the beginning of the unraveling. Ethan stirred beside me, his arm reaching instinctively for me before his eyes fluttered open. The moment he saw my expression, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" I hesitated, debating whether or not to tell him, but there was no hiding the way my body had gone rigid, the way my breath had become uneven. "Karen wants to see me, first thing." Ethan sat up, his posture shifting instantly, the ease of sleep disappearing as his mind clicked into high alert. "Do you think she knows?" I exhaled, my grip tightening around my phone. I don't know, but I have a really bad feeling about this. Silence settled between us, thick and heavy. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the calculations, the worst-case scenarios playing out behind his eyes. I knew the answer before he even spoke, but still, I waited for him to say it. Then we prepare for the worst. I swallowed hard, nodding, but deep down I already knew. The worst was coming, whether we were ready for it or not. The drive to work felt endless, even though it was barely 15 minutes. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, my heart pounding with every streetlight I passed. I told myself to stay calm, to breathe, but it didn't help. Karen wouldn't ask to see me first thing if it wasn't serious, and that meant she either suspected something or she already knew. When I walked into the office, the usual hum of morning chatter sounded louder, more pointed. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe people really were whispering about me. I kept my head down, moving quickly to my desk to drop my bag before heading straight to Karen's office. Every step felt heavier, the anxiety thickening in my chest like a slow-building storm. I knocked once, barely registering the sound before Karen's voice called, "Come in." The moment I stepped inside, I knew. Her expression was carefully neutral, too controlled. She gestured toward the chair across from her desk, and I forced myself to sit, even though my legs wanted to bolt. "Thanks for coming in so early," she said, her voice polite, measured. "Of course," I replied, my fingers curling slightly against my lap. "You said you needed to talk." Karen folded her hands on the desk, studying me. "I want you to understand that I take workplace integrity very seriously, Olivia, and when I hear things, rumors, I don't like to act without evidence, but I also can't ignore them." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet her gaze. "I understand." She nodded, exhaling softly. "Good, then I need to ask you outright, are you involved in a personal relationship with Ethan Montgomery?" My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. Every possible response ran through my mind at lightning speed. I could deny it, I could lie, but I knew Karen. She wouldn't have brought me in here unless she had something more than just whispers. So I did the only thing I could do. I told the truth. "Yes." Karen's expression didn't shift, but I saw the faint tightening of her jaw, the subtle flicker of disappointment in her eyes. That's what I thought. I exhaled slowly, gripping the arms of the chair. "Karen, I know how this looks, but..." She held up a hand, stopping me. "Olivia, I'm not here to judge you, but you need to understand that this is a serious issue, a conflict of interest, and I have to report it." The room spun for a second. I had known this was coming, had felt it creeping up on me like a shadow I couldn't outrun, but hearing it aloud made it real. What happens now? Karen sighed, leaning back slightly. "That depends. Company policy states that relationships between employees, especially those involving direct supervisors, must be disclosed. HR will have to conduct a review, and in most cases, one of the involved parties will need to be reassigned. Or..." I forced myself to ask, "Or what?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Or one of you resigns." The words hit like a punch to the stomach. I felt suddenly weightless, like I was floating just outside my own body. "Karen, I'm giving you a chance to get ahead of this," she interrupted, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. "I'm not your enemy here, Olivia, but you need to make a decision, and you need to do it soon." I nodded, numb, my mind already spiraling with possibilities, none of them good. "Thank you for being honest with me." Karen gave a small nod. "I suggest you do the same with Ethan." I stood, legs shaky, and somehow managed to make it out of her office without falling apart. But as I walked back to my desk, reality hit me like a freight train. Everything was about to change. And I wasn't sure if we could survive it. I barely remembered walking back to my desk, but the weight of Karen's words clung to me like a suffocating fog. "One of you resigns." The sentence looped in my mind, a threat, a warning, a promise of the disaster that was now fully unraveling. My fingers trembled as I reached for my mouse, attempting to focus on my inbox, but the words on the screen blurred into nothing. I felt like I was waiting for the inevitable impact, the moment everything around me shattered beyond repair. I needed to tell Ethan, but how do you tell someone that the world you built together in secrecy is about to collapse, that there are only two choices left, end it or blow up both of our lives? I made it until lunchtime before my resolve cracked. I couldn't pretend to be fine, couldn't act like I wasn't sitting at my desk counting down the minutes until HR made their next move. I pushed back my chair, ignoring the looks from my coworkers, and made my way to Ethan's office. The door was closed. I hesitated for only a second before knocking. "Come in," his voice called, steady, unbothered. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. Ethan was sitting at his desk, reviewing paperwork, his face unreadable. But the moment he saw me, really saw me, his expression darkened. He knew. Maybe he had been expecting this moment, waiting for the inevitable fallout. "What happened?" His voice was quieter now, more careful. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Karen knows, HR knows, I admitted it. A slow exhale measured, controlled, and... I hesitated, my nails digging into my palms. We have two options. One of us gets reassigned or one of us resigns. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the armrest as if considering every possible scenario, every move left on the board. They won't reassign me. My position is too high up. I already knew that, which means the only option is... You leaving, he finished, the words colder than I had expected. That's what they want. A lump formed in my throat. They didn't say that outright, but it's obvious, isn't it? I'm the easier problem to solve. Ethan's jaw clenched. No, I won't let that happen. I let out a hollow laugh, my hands tightening into fists. And what exactly are you going to do? Fight corporate policy? Convince them that this is all some misunderstanding? It won't matter, Ethan, the damage is done. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. So what? You're just going to walk away just like that? What other choice do I have? My voice cracked despite my best efforts. This job was supposed to be my fresh start, and now it's turned into a disaster. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration radiating off him in waves. I won't let you leave because of me. I swallowed, my chest aching. You might not have a choice. For the first time since I walked into his office, Ethan looked lost, like he was fighting a battle he already knew he was going to lose. I wanted to reach for him, to tell him we'd figure it out, but I couldn't lie to either of us. We were at the breaking point, and neither of us knew how to stop the fall. The silence in Ethan's office was thick, suffocating, like the weight of our reality was pressing down on us both. His sharp gaze never left mine, but the usual confidence in his expression had cracked, replaced with something I hadn't seen before: uncertainty, maybe even fear. I sat down in the chair across from him, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking. What are we going to do? My voice was quieter than I intended, but it felt impossible to be strong right now. Ethan exhaled sharply, pacing behind his desk. We fight it, we go to HR together, lay everything out. This wasn't some office fling, it's real. His jaw tensed, his hands running through his hair. They can't punish us for that. I let out a hollow laugh. You really think they care about how real this is? Ethan, they care about policies, not feelings. We broke the rules. They're giving us a way out, and if we don't take it, they'll make this even harder on us. His pacing stopped. He turned to face me fully, eyes searching mine. So that's it, you're just going to walk away, leave the job you worked so hard for. Leave. He cut himself off, his jaw clenching, but I already knew what he was going to say. Leave him. A lump formed in my throat. I don't want to, but what choice do we have? If we fight this, we both lose, and you know they'll find a way to protect you before they protect me. Ethan's hands balled into fists. That's not fair. None of this is fair, I shot back, the emotion bubbling over. But it's happening, and if we don't decide now, they'll decide for us. He stared at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he reached for the phone on his desk and dialed. Karen, my office now. I sucked in a breath, my heart hammering as I watched him make the call. I wasn't sure what he was about to do, but one thing was clear. Ethan Montgomery wasn't going down without a fight. Karen arrived within minutes, her expression unreadable as she stepped into Ethan's office and quietly shut the door behind her. She took one glance between us, her gaze lingering on me for just a second too long before she turned her attention fully to Ethan. This better be important. Ethan didn't hesitate. I want to discuss an alternative solution. Karen arched a brow, arms folding across her chest. Alternative to what? You already know the options. Either Olivia resigns or we move forward with a formal review. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering at the cold finality of her words. There has to be something else, a way to make this work without destroying my career. Karen sighed, shaking her head slightly. Ethan, you know as well as I do that the board won't allow an exception. Romantic involvement between direct superiors and subordinates is a line they refuse to blur. You can argue all day about the legitimacy of the relationship, but the policy is clear. Ethan's jaw tensed. Then transfer Olivia, move her to another department. Hell, create a new role for her if you have to, but don't force her out of a job over this. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. You know that's not how this works. It's not just about separating you two, it's about what's already been compromised. If this relationship has been going on for weeks, HR will argue that every decision made involving Olivia was biased. That's the problem, and that's what they'll use against you. I felt sick. It wasn't just about perception, it was about control. They had already decided that the only solution was for one of us to leave. They weren't going to bend, they weren't going to listen. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes dark as he looked at me. Then I'll resign. Karen blinked, caught off guard. What? You heard me. If this company wants to make an example out of someone, let it be me. Olivia has her entire future ahead of her. She shouldn't be the one to pay for this. Panic surged through me, my breath catching. Ethan, no, that's insane. You've built your career here. You can't just walk away. He turned to me, his expression softer now, but there was steel behind his eyes. And you can. You think I'm just going to sit back and watch you throw away everything you've worked for? Not happening. Karen sighed, rubbing her temples. I can't stop you if that's what you want to do, Ethan, but you should know that once this gets out, the board won't just accept your resignation quietly. They'll spin it however they need to, and it won't be in your favor. Ethan didn't even flinch. Let them. I don't care about their politics. I care about Olivia. Tears burned at the back of my throat. This isn't fair. You shouldn't have to do this for me. His gaze softened, his fingers brushing against mine briefly before he pulled away. Some things are worth it. Karen stood, straightening her blazer. I'll notify HR. If you're serious, we'll process your resignation within the next few days. Ethan nodded, resolute. I wanted to stop him. I wanted to grab him and tell him that we could figure out another way, but deep down I knew this was his choice, and once it was made, there was no turning back. The next 24 hours passed in a haze, like I was watching everything unfold from outside my own body. Ethan had handed in his resignation first thing in the morning. There had been no dramatic meetings, no drawn-out fights, just a simple, clean break, but that didn't mean the storm wasn't coming. By noon, the whispers had already started. Word traveled fast in a company like ours, and by the time I stepped into the break room for a cup of coffee, the air was thick with speculation. I could feel the eyes on me, hear the hushed voices as soon as I turned my back. Did you hear? He's really leaving. HR isn't even giving a statement about it. Makes you wonder. Maybe it's got something to do with her. I gripped my coffee cup tighter, my stomach twisting. I had expected this, but that didn't make it any easier. People loved a scandal, and now, whether I liked it or not, I was at the center of one. I barely made it through the rest of the workday. By the time I sat at my desk, my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. Meet me at my place after work. I didn't hesitate. I left the office before anyone else, keeping my head down as I stepped into the elevator, avoiding the curious glances thrown my way. When I arrived at Ethan's apartment, the door was already unlocked, like he'd been waiting for me. He stood by the window, a drink in hand, staring out at the city skyline. The tension in his shoulders was visible even from across the room. They're talking, aren't they? I dropped my bag onto the couch, exhaling. Of course they are. They don't know what happened, so they're filling in the blanks themselves. Ethan turned to face me, his expression unreadable. And what do they think? I shrugged, trying to keep my voice steady. That I slept my way to the top, that you got caught and took the fall for it, that there was some kind of cover-up, pick your favorite. His jaw tightened. That's bullshit. Of course it is, but people believe what they want to believe, and now that you're gone, I'm the only one left for them to pick apart. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hands gripping my shoulders. Then quit, walk away with me. My breath hitched, my heart pounding. Ethan, I can't just. Why not? His voice was low, urgent. What's left for you there? A bunch of people who don't respect you, a company that was willing to push you out the second they had an excuse. You don't owe them anything. I swallowed hard, and then what? We just start over somewhere else, pretend this never happened. His grip softened, his thumbs brushing against my arms. We figure it out together. For the first time since this nightmare began, I let myself consider it, walking away, leaving it all behind, starting over with him wherever that might be, but the thought of it terrified me just as much as staying did. Because once I made that choice, there would be no going back. And I still didn't know if I was ready. I stood there staring at Ethan, my pulse a frantic rhythm in my ears. His hands were still on my arms, his touch grounding me even as my entire world felt like it was unraveling. We figure it out together. His voice was steady, certain, but I wasn't sure if I was. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to throw every ounce of caution to the wind and walk away from the whispers, the judgment, the inevitable glass ceiling that had been placed above me the moment HR got involved. But there was something terrifying about making that choice, about putting my entire future in the hands of something I wasn't sure could survive the weight of reality. Ethan must have seen the hesitation in my eyes because his fingers tightened slightly. Olivia, I need to know what you want, not what you think is the right thing, not what everyone else is telling you, just you. The air felt too thick to breathe. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I just don't know. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his gaze, something raw and unguarded. Then let's stop thinking about it for just 1 second, he murmured, his hand sliding down to lace his fingers with mine. What does your gut tell you? My gut was screaming that I couldn't keep living my life afraid of making mistakes, that I had fought so hard to be where I was, and yet for the first time I wasn't sure if this was even the place I wanted to be, that I was tired of constantly looking over my shoulder, of trying to meet expectations that had never really belonged to me, that the only thing that had ever felt real, truly, undeniably real, was the way Ethan looked at me. The way he made me feel like I was more than a title, more than a career, more than the mess we had created. I exhaled slowly. I don't want to stay. His lips parted slightly, like he hadn't been expecting me to say it. You do. I shook my head. No, but I don't just want to leave because it's the easy way out. I need to know that we're doing this for the right reasons, that it's not just about running. Ethan nodded slowly, his grip on my hand firm. Then let's not run, let's move forward, let's build something that's ours, on our terms. A slow, cautious hope started to bloom in my chest, fragile but growing. Okay. The relief in his eyes was instant, but he didn't move to celebrate. He just watched me, making sure I meant it, making sure I wasn't going to pull away. Okay. I smiled softly, squeezing his hand. Okay. And just like that, the decision was made. There was no going back now. We were living together.
Thank you for watching the video. If you want to hear more stories, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Videos are released every day. Good luck to everyone.